Welcome to the Golden Shadow. My name is Alyssa.
And I'm Arran Rogerson.
And today we are discussing somatic experiencing, also known as SE, a body-oriented therapeutic modality created by Dr. Peter Levine that focuses on healing trauma and PTSD through practices that release traumatic shock in the body and help regulate the nervous system. And finally, I said to Arran, we're covering somatics on the podcast.
I wasn't sure what that meant.
Finally, because this is my feeling. Because especially my orientation is very Jungian, which is very in the imaginal, the archetypal, the mythological. It's sort of disembodied in a way. And that is a critique that you sometimes see with especially classical Jungian work is where's the bottom-up approach? Where is the body? It's only really in, I think, recent time, and especially with the work of Marion Woodman, who is a Jungian analyst, that the conversation of psyche and soma from a Jungian perspective kind of came to the forefront. But for the most part, Jungians are like dream work, active imagination, like let's talk about mythology. And there isn't a lot of attention and tending to the body in people's lives.
Do you think that's actually a Jung thing? Is that like Jung in his work kind of ignored the body? Maybe because he was SE inferior?
It's like an interesting idea, right? Because we at least presume that he was an introverted intuitive, and his work is really known as a very thinking forward and very intuitive forward. But I remember reading Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which is his semi-autobiography. Yeah. And he talks about this time of distress that he went through, the confrontation with the unconscious after breaking from Freud and going through all of this turmoil, and how he would go into these kind of overwhelmed states. And he mentioned specifically like using yogic breathing to calm himself down. And I was like, I do that. Like I've had to learn to do that. So I think, and I haven't read like Jung's work about yoga. I know there's some material on that, but I don't think it was something he talked about a lot in his books. I've read quite a bit of the collected works, not all of it, but it is more focused on the dynamics of the psyche. And there are aspects of the body that do come in, but as a main focus of how to navigate issues in life, and it wasn't necessarily, I think, his main focus or his main work.
There is an intellectual bias that is pervasive just in general. I mean, the internet itself, I think, really disembodies everyone. And so a lot of the information that spreads and a lot of the ideas that spread and the ways of approaching the world are naturally disembodied because that's how you spread information, right? Yeah. You spread information through intellectualism and talking, not through the body. Yeah. It's a more difficult thing to sort of just transfer through a book, for instance. Yeah. That'd be another reason we might just have sort of intellectual bias when we approach a lot of Jung's work and just reality in general. And that's part of the point of somatics, is that we're very egoic. Yeah. We tend to operate from a top-down position on the world. We tend to approach a lot of our problems from a top-down approach, which is like, I'll just read all these books and that's how I'll cure my trauma. It's just like more and more theory, more and more ideas, concepts. And when we do this, we're largely ignoring the origin of much of our wounding and much of our struggle, which is from the bottom up or from the body up. And so a really simple way to demonstrate this, I think, is that if you are depressed, for instance, if you're dealing with a lot of sadness or anxiety, it's easy to think that you need to find some sort of explanation or answer or read a book that's going to explain to you how to not be depressed anymore. Yeah. And the truth is that if you actually just get more sleep and exercise and get some sunshine and drink lots of water, you'll stop being depressed. And that's weird, right? It's like, well, that's too simple. Like, that's too simple.
Yeah.
But it's true because it's in the body. And
Right.
if your body is suffering, it translates to your mind suffering, except our ego forgets about the body and just sort of pretends like, I'm suffering. Why? I must have an incorrect, like, theoretical system or something. So if we actually approach,
like, I need to change my outlook on life. Like, that's my problem.
Right. Where it's like, if you just ease the body, take care of the body, make the body feel safe, you'll actually be much more successful in approaching a lot of these issues.
Yeah.
The same way that you might approach a baby, for instance. If a baby is suffering, if you just like explain to it, you're not in danger. Look, there's no one dangerous around here. Like, you don't need to be crying. Hey, you'll be okay, baby. Like, cheer up. Like, trying to explain theory to the baby isn't going to work, obviously. So what you do, you take the baby, you hold it, you rock it, you swaddle it, you comfort it, and that actually works. Same with like an animal. We won't treat an animal as if it's some sort of like person, which we need to sort of theoretically explain the world to. Animals respond to much more embodied, much more basic realities. Right. And so if you want an animal to feel safe, touch it, pet it, feed it, give it a nice place to sleep. Yeah. And it'll do better. And that's true for ourselves, though we largely ignore that, is that if you want to help yourself, maybe treat yourself like you're a little baby or like a little dog that needs to be taken care of. And you'll actually be more successful in making sense of these problems. So somatics and somatic experiencing, specifically what we're talking about today, is sort of exploring this idea of bottom-up therapy. So approaching the body first, the body as primary, as opposed to top-down talk therapy or other forms of more objectified intellectual exploration in order to solve our problems.
Or maybe what we might consider to be standard types of psychotherapy, which are sort of born out of the Socratic traditions.
Sure.
A lot of, I don't understand this fully. I'm not a trained therapist, but my understanding is that the way that we think about a lot of modern Western therapy, especially as it moves more and more towards the cognitive behavioral realm, is first and foremost about talking out and the dialectic between the therapist and the client. And that is extremely powerful. That requires a whole episode that we should do, really, on like the Socratic method or the idea behind the dialectic.
Sure. I mean, the Socratic method essentially is just questions.
Yeah.
You just ask lots of questions.
Right.
And if you interrogate someone and they allow you to interrogate you, if you allow them to interrogate you, then it'll actually bring out a lot of stuff you didn't know was there.
Right. And that's powerful. Yeah. What I have found, and I think that this might be true for a lot of people, is that the complexity of experience is that the talk therapy only goes so far. So it's not to say the top-down approach doesn't work or that it doesn't have a place, but rather it's like one piece of the puzzle. And we haven't really, as a society, given a lot of time or space to tend to the bottom-up approach. And that's what somatic experiencing is doing. It sort of interestingly is acknowledging that first and foremost, like as human beings, we've evolved with this very powerful and very intelligent nervous system and physiological system that knows how to respond to events that seem life-threatening. And Dr. Peter Levine viewed sort of like the animal kingdom. Like he saw that animals went under periods of distress if they were being chased and their lives were on the line. But why didn't animals become traumatized? What is it about the human experience that causes this? And so what we acknowledge is that despite the nature of our body to self-regulate, that process can become disrupted. And when that process is halted, dysregulation happens. It leads to a psyche and a body that fragments. There are these sort of like unclosed physiological loops that are just stuck. And that builds this kind of energy inside the body that leads to ailments that we might now know as post-traumatic post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right. So we're talking about trauma.
Yeah.
And SE is aimed at relieving trauma, healing trauma, and PTSD. So, as Alyssa said, trauma is kind of, excuse me, my alarm is going off. Trauma can be thought of as sort of like an interrupted process, right?
Yeah,
So
like
if animals are frightened or they're attacked or they break their leg or fall into a hole, like they'll have natural physiological processes that happen that are designed to process the
yeah,
stress. Not that animals are as simple as machines, but you could think about it like a machine that has its own pathways through its body that are used to take the most optimal action or metabolize things,
yes, yeah,
redirect energy, heal things. So if you're frightened, for instance, if you're stressed out, if you're confronting some sort of chaos in front of you, the body is going to prepare for that. It's going to pump you full of certain chemicals
yeah,
to get you to get ready to fight or to run.
right,
And as it goes through that process of like fight or flight or freeze, we can get into the freeze. But as it does that, the body is actually going through a sort of mechanistic process
yeah,
from beginning to end, and that might involve the fighting or flighting. And then after you fight or flight, there might be sort of a like tuning down portion where your body is kind of shaking and
yeah.
processing
It's
what's happened to it.
discharging.
Discharging.
That's what he viewed, and I think when you look up Peter Levine's work in these videos, he'll often show an animal that's being chased and it gets caught. It plays dead for a time, and then when it seems like it's safe, the body of the animal starts to shake, and then it runs off.
Yeah.
And so what we see is that there's a process that's responding to the threat. In this case, it couldn't run, it couldn't fight, so it went into freeze state, which is like a total shutting down of the nervous system. And then the nervous system comes back online. It starts shaking. Maybe it's releasing some of those chemicals, and then it moves again. But what happens with humans that stops that process?
Right. So, I mean, humans are animals, and the way that they respond to stress or to chaos in their lives is not exactly the same way that like a deer might
Yeah.
respond, but it is not completely different, not absolutely different. And so, if you can sort of imagine a human that is completely kind of like wild and free and not inhibited, humans might do things like they might run, they might fight, they might hide, they might scream for help, they might shake if they've experienced something really shocking. I mean, that's something that we don't really encounter very often in everyday life, but like we're still kind of familiar with the idea that someone who's been through a really scary episode, maybe they've just gotten into a car accident.
Yeah.
You might see them kind of shaking, or their eyes are really wide, or they're kind of doing this rocking motion.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah.
we're familiar with that idea, and even though we're familiar, we might not understand what exactly is happening. But you can imagine that the body is essentially going through a natural process that is completely automatic. It's not rational,
Yeah.
and it's doing this to process the stress.
Yeah.
And the point, this is overly simplistic, but is trauma is when those processes are stopped in their tracks. And if they're stopped, let's say if you were going to, for instance, scream if you were frightened, or run or fight in a situation, maybe for some reason you wouldn't.
Yeah.
Maybe because it's not appropriate, or you're embarrassed, or you've been conditioned or taught that this is not a good way to behave for whatever reason. You might stop yourself from running and hiding. You might stop yourself from screaming out. You might stop yourself from venting anger by, hitting something. You might stop yourself from shaking or convulsing.
Yeah.
Because what would other people think if they saw you doing this, right?
Right. There's this interesting new factor for humans, which is consciousness, and our ability to control these processes to some degree is part of what blocks these loops, or we're in an environment where we don't feel safe enough to do it, or it's so chronic, like the stress happens all of the time or enough that you're in constant states of like hyperarousal
Yeah.
or feeling unsafe, that your body has now moved into needing to be on high alert all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where like the nuance between like an acute experience that leads to post-traumatic stress disorder versus some sort of ongoing stressful experience that leads to complex PTSD,
Mm-hmm.
which are similar, but there's like actually quite a big nuance. But that's another episode to get into that.
Right. So childhood trauma is really common.
Yeah.
I think that we argued in our episode about trauma, which was a really early one. That might have been like the 5th episode we did.
Yeah. Very
But,
early.
you know, that trauma is universal, and that pretty much everyone experiences childhood trauma in some way. Maybe that's a product of our strange modern world.
Yeah.
Maybe it doesn't matter what time or age you live in, the trauma is still part of childhood. But you can imagine a child, for instance, in a household with abusive parents, and it's a weird situation because the child can't really go anywhere. There's no place to run. So there's no flight.
Yeah.
Can't really fight his parents or anything, or beat away this like sort of chaotic thing. So there's no fight. Might not have any place to hide either.
Yeah.
Might not be allowed to cry for whatever reason. Might not have anyone to go talk to that's going to make them feel safe, like an aunt and uncle who could protect them. So if you can imagine a situation like this, which unfortunately I don't think is that uncommon, you can see that all the processes that would be implemented by the body to deal with a very stressful situation are being stopped in their tracks.
Yeah.
And so all this energy, all this kind of negativity and stress, and chemically it could be cortisol. More metaphorically, you could say like it's shadow, essentially. It's darkness. It's like it's all locked away, it's suppressed, and it's compartmentalized. And that's what trauma is.
Yeah.
Put pretty simplistically.
Yeah.
And so SE is aimed at releasing that trauma by re-implementing these processes.
Yeah. It's like trying to get us back into the experiences of the body so that we can not only get in contact with that sort of survival energy that was thwarted for whatever reason, but we can also then find a sort of resolution and a closure, because it's not just an emotional closure. It's not just like, I need to feel like I got over what happened to me. Coming from the bottom up approach, we recognize that maybe you intellectually feel past it, but your body is not.
Right.
And what's really going on in the body, I think, especially when in trauma is a spectrum, by the way. So there can be sort of low grade symptoms of this and quite extreme symptoms of this. But often what's happening is like the body, it's not that the body's being hijacked. That's kind of the words that come to mind, but it's like the body's doing what it's supposed to do. It's just sort of, it's dysregulated. It's no longer closing those loops in a balanced way, but rather you're kind of stuck. So you move into hyperarousal and you're just stuck there. And then finally you come back down and then you get triggered again and you're back there. And then you kind of come back down. So there's no sense of release that the body has had. And with those biological reactions that kind of trigger also often comes emotional experiences, thought patterns, heaviness in the body. It's like this full spectrum of experience. And so SE is trying to get you to gently ease back into this process. And that's like a really important fundamental pillar of SE, is that we're not trying to re-traumatize people, because often individuals who are suffering from PTSD in some form, it's very, very difficult to return to those feelings. It's very difficult to sit with that in the body because it immediately enacts an overwhelm. Like all the alarm bells might go off, or maybe you are more of a hypoarousal. So it's like you dissociate, you just totally turn off. So there's like the two spectrums of that, hyper or hypoarousal. But SE is trying to get you back into that place to learn what's happening in the body, to become aware of it, and to come into relationship with it so that you can find some peace.
So SE is, I don't think it's something that you get licensed for. I'm sure there are training programs and certificates, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think my understanding is that Peter Levine has like developed this to the point that individuals can go through I believe, multi-year training program.
Okay. The point is that we're not licensed. We're not experts on SE. And if you've listened to the podcast for a while, you understand that we are just approaching one of these modalities and ideas sort of conceptually and as sort of a overview of you could explore this and learn about it yourself. Alyssa has done SE with someone else.
Yeah, with a therapist who was a certified practitioner. And I will say, fun fact, the reason why I started getting interested in SE was like, I kind of heard about it. I forget where I was, some event, just very like casually, this title of a book, Waking the Tiger, was mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And then one day I kind of turn around looking at my bookshelf and I'm like, whoa, Waking the Tiger, I have that book. And I remembered you gave me that book. Not that you read it.
I knew that you needed
it. It was your grandpa's book. But Waking the Tiger is
supposed to leave that part out.
He just planted it. I
was like,
he knew.
This is what Alyssa needs. Waking the Tiger.
But it was true. It was a really beautiful synchronistic moment. Because I'd been very steeped in Jungian theory for a long time, and in also like just standard talk therapy interactions with therapists, which I felt only went so far. And if you want to kind of understand more of like the personal story, you can read the Substack post that will go out around the same time as this episode, where I write kind of about what led me to SE and this interesting dream I had, and etc. But SE kind of came in at a time where like I needed to tend to the body because I was having what might be called somatization, which is like embodied symptoms of the issues that I was experiencing. And talk therapy was only going so far. And as powerful and as exciting it was for me to do dream work and active imagination, all this stuff, it was becoming very, very obvious that I was not paying attention to this other level of experience. So that's the perspective that I'm coming from. It's been a very interesting journey, still learning a lot. And it's useful for anybody really to open up that door to somatics, because there's so many ways. Like, it doesn't have to be SE. It could be yoga. It could be breath work. It could be Tai Chi. Like, it could be running.
Right. Part of the point is that if you just sort of think about approaching yourself therapeutically in this way, I mean, everyone listening to the podcast probably is trying to improve themselves or has some kind of self-work journey that they're on. And even if you're not going to specifically do SE, just keeping in mind that a lot of what you're trying to do would actually be better approached if you thought about it going through the body first, and not just reading books, listening to podcast after podcast after podcast.
Yeah.
Obviously, like, this is a podcast. It's very, very intellectual. And we're saying that like this podcast can't heal you, but if you try to work on your body and work through the body, that can be useful in all kinds of ways. But the point I was making is that we're not experts, but despite not being experts and not having a huge amount of experience with SE, we are going to try and walk through some examples of working with this and some, I don't know if technique is the right word, but like ways of approaching SE that Peter Levine or someone associated with Peter Levine might have come up with. So
forgive us if we're not perfect. This is sort of like our interpretation of it.
Right. As with every episode, we're just exploring. So the first thing we're going to explore is the SIBAM model.
Yeah.
And SIBAM is SIBAM, which stands for sensation, imagery, behavior, affect, and meaning.
Yep.
Meaning could also be called cognition in some interpretations. But this is a sort of 5-part model of experience. So it's a way of thinking about experience in terms of 5 different domains, 5 different ways in which we experience things.
Yeah,
So
the channels, the 5 channels.
right. So for example, we might experience an event or what have you through sensation, which is sort of what's in the body. What am I feeling in my body? Where is it in my body? Is it in my chest? Is it in my fingertips? Is it in my eyes? Image, so visuals, pictures, symbols, scenes. What kind of scene is brought up for me when I focus on this thing? Behavior, the next one, that might have to do with what actions are you taking in response to experiencing this thing. Maybe you are clenching your fists, or maybe you are your heart rate's going up and you're moving around more, or maybe you're running to hide, or maybe you're running to go have a beer to like calm yourself down. So behavior. Affect, the next one is emotions, feelings. So I'm feeling anger, or I'm feeling really sad, or I'm feeling a lot of fear, etc. Last one, meaning. This is probably the most difficult one, I feel like, to kind of conceptualize or explain, but essentially, what are the thoughts or beliefs that are coming up? One way I like to think about it is like, what is the narrative here? How does this fit into my narrative of myself? Which is like
what story am I telling myself right now about like what happened and what it means? Just like, F that person, like they are terrible, or like I am this, like it's these different judgments, the way that you start to come to conclusions about what that experience was, which actually informs a great deal of our sort of, we always talk about the ego, like constructing the narrative all the time. It's like, that's like major ego domain for sure.
And so this model can be used as a way of working through some kind of focus, some sort of experience. It could be anything really.
Yeah, I mean, partly when I worked with my SC therapist, I didn't see this utilized in a way that it's like, okay, we're using Cybam now. But rather that she would begin to point out as I was maybe talking about something or explaining something that, especially with me, she would say a lot, Alyssa, you're very image heavy. Because as I was trying to go into the body and explain a certain sensation, I'd be like, there's actually like an image of a child right here to the right. It's like my experience, very focused on this channel, would produce symbols and imagery. But it also sort of pointed to an interesting thing, that I was not as tapped into the sensation channel. So the way to move through it, and in a way that I've liked to approach it, is, maybe this isn't SE proper, but it is like, after an experience, kind of go through the Cybam and figure out how you are experiencing it through each of the channels. And it's actually quite a powerful experience to journal on, or to help have someone facilitate for you.
So we're going to walk through it right now live. This is maybe not typically how someone uses the model, is to actually just walk through all 5 domains one after the other. Though I have found, for me, I find it useful, and I use it on myself, and I've used it in coaching and have found it to be useful of getting kind of the lay of the land of a certain situation.
I'd be interested to know if anyone listening like knows more about this. Leave us a comment, but we'll walk through this as an example of what the channels are like, and you can utilize it then as this reflective tool, but also as an indicator of like what's really happening from that bottom up experience.
So I'm going to choose a focus, and the focus I'm going to choose, again, this is kind of contrived because this isn't an actual therapeutic setting, but I'm going to choose an experience I had that's been bothering me for a while, off and on. Whenever it comes up, whenever I remember this experience, it always kind of gives me this like really negative, kind of cringy feeling. And it is specifically when I was at a party and I was standing around in a circle with at least like 5 or 6 of my friends, and we were talking, and a girl came to the party. She had just gotten there, and she was wearing a lot of makeup, and the makeup was kind of extreme, but I didn't think it was makeup. I thought that she was sunburned. And I said, just out loud in front of everyone, I was like, "Are you really sunburned?" And she wasn't. She was just wearing a bunch of makeup, and she rubbed her face a whole bunch and smeared the makeup and walked away really, really embarrassed. And it's multi-layered. I mean, it ties into a lot of different things about me and like social awkwardness and being a little too honest about what I think, being a little too aspy, you might say. But I get really embarrassed when I think about that, and I feel really shameful of myself. And sometimes it just like I remember that memory and it sticks out. It might even be kind of like an archetypal social memory for me. And it has this actually like physiological effect on me.
Yeah.
So we're gonna Cybam it right
Cybam
now.
it.
And Alyssa's gonna coach me through it.
Okay. So as you're thinking through this experience, can you notice what's happening in your body? Any sensations? Maybe any changes in your breathing? Maybe a shift in temperature?
There's increased heart rate. There's a lot of tightness around the eyes for some reason. There's kind of like fist clenching. Yeah.
Okay.
So those are all sensations.
Okay. So let's move to the image side. So you think about the experience. Is there any organic, natural, spontaneous imagery that comes to mind? And maybe it's the memory that feels very vivid. Maybe like seeing your friends' faces, or maybe a different image comes up.
The memory is visual. Obviously, that's a pretty literal way to approach this. If I kind of let myself kind of active imagine it, you might say, which I think is something that's interesting to do with this. There's kind of the image that I'm sort of like isolating myself from everyone there. Like I've created some sort of foul and I don't belong because of that. Like I'm being exiled.
What is the image? Can you describe what that image looks like?
The image is that I'm there in the memory, and I've just said this thing to this girl, and then as that's happened, I am sort of sinking back away from the image and my friends, and I'm kind of sliding away into darkness.
Okay. Let's move to behavior.
Okay.
Is there anything that your body feels like it's doing or wants to do in response to the thought? You mentioned your fists clenching. This is sort of more of a behavior channel. So anything around that, like physical actions, fidgeting, the way your body's moving.
There is the impulse to, it's hard to explain. I don't want to say it's a violent impulse, but I guess it kind of is. And I would argue that's kind of like a very masculine response to things like this. But there's sort of like a feeling of like fists clenching, like I want to sort of like beat away or push away the memory or something. Like I want it to get away from me, almost as if like it was just some sort of illusion. And if I were to kind of like punch at it or push at it, it would just sort of like vanish or like break down or crumble in front of me, and I could sort of get away from it. If I'm thinking like more literal action, there's like the idea of like I don't want to see this person again because I feel so ashamed, and maybe I don't want to see this group of people anymore because I feel ashamed, and like maybe I don't belong there, so maybe I should find like a different place to hang out, or maybe I should follow some of my fantasies that I have and just like go walk into the forest and never come back. And those aren't very realistic, but they can still lead to like literal behavior, like being a little less social than normal or something like that.
Yeah. So the affect channel is about emotions. What feelings are coming up and what emotions? And try to name them.
I think there's a lot of fear. The fear, I think, is connected to like loneliness or failure or like not fitting in. So there's sadness there too. Embarrassment, shame. You know, it's hard to isolate the emotions without getting into like meaning, getting into like behavior and stuff like that. But like fear is probably the best way to explain it.
He brought up meaning, which often comes on the tail ends of some of these things, like the emotions. So are there any other thoughts or beliefs or conclusions that you're coming to as you think about this experience?
Right. So this is easier for me.
Yes.
Because this is like cognition, and this is where most of my energy is at. I mean, the thoughts are that I have like poor social skills in some ways, and that I am overly honest. That I am a sort of strange person and don't really fit into most social scenes. There's explanations of like I should do a better job. There's self-work that I'm thinking about that I could do, like you know, be more warm and receptive and less truth oriented, less sort of blurting out whatever I'm thinking. There's sort of like the idea that like I should have done something different. I should have apologized to her. I should have like found her and said, I'm sorry I said that. That it's like my, you know, my bad, like not hers at all, and that she looks fine. And there's also how it ties into like the self-narrative of like this is a like recurring experience for me of like committing some sort of social foul that stems from me being too on the nose or too direct. And that has something to do with like my self-story and my identity and the things that go wrong with my relationships occasionally. So anyways, like I could just keep going and going and going and going.
That's enough.
Yeah.
Okay. And end of exercise.
End of exercise. Side bam.
Side bam. That's how we end it in our professional sessions.
That's what Peter Levine does.
So one thing about walking through it in this way that I think in part when I've done this, there's kind of different ways to do it, but sometimes like really dialing it in and not allowing yourself or the other person to push too much into a different area. Catching like when meaning is coming up in the affect channel and like slowing that down and just be like, let's only list these words.
Right.
Is important, right? We're really trying to isolate for a reason. But another thing I see, and like that I was seeing even with you when we were in the behavior channels, is this impulse to want to push back or fight. If this was like a full session, I might even invite you to lean into that physicality and physically push your hands out, or you might push up like against a wall too. Like, what is it like? Because like what's happening in the body that wants it to do something like grip the fist or punch out or push against something speaks to a deep internal need, like a body, mind, heart, spirit need. So SC also will employ actually doing that action so that, you know, it would be good for you before we moved on to the affect channel to allow yourself in that moment to feel what it's like to push against it. And that's like a way that you can kind of take off into that channel. Or maybe after you did all of those silos, you know that you want to hone in on something that happened and you want to experiment with it like yourself. It's like, I really noticed that impulse to push, push, push. So you're just going to go do that, for like 30 seconds
Yeah.
and see how that feels. And that's part of the experience, I think, of doing SE is like allowing your body to do what's coming natural, even though it might feel weird, strange, uncomfortable, inappropriate. It's actually quite amazing. Like one time my therapist was having me push against a wall and scream. And I was like, I hate this. Like, I don't want to do this. I felt so awkward. And
So
yet
that's why you were screaming.
stop. But after I did it, there was like this huge, like, like a really big feeling of like release.
The sideband model is interesting because you can kind of think of it as like 5 different domains to balance out also. And like, it's like you should aim for trying to have like sufficient focus in each of these areas when you are experiencing anything, or just like the way that you are in touch with your life. And if you are someone, for instance, who like has trouble with the sensation part, or like it feels kind of unfamiliar or foreign, like that means that like sensation is perhaps something that you could work on.
Yeah, or like nothing's coming up.
Yeah. Which sounds like a strange idea, but maybe that would be true for certain people. If like I don't know how to answer the meaning part, like I just
absolutely
I don't know what's coming up there.
I think like especially on like the emotion side, some people sometimes are like truly out of touch because that part has sort of been fragmented. It's been like split off. So when you're really like, no, like don't go to the meaning of it or don't go to this image of it. Like what's the pure emotion? And it's like, I don't know. That is some people's experience. So as you said, it's like you can begin to find where you naturally go and where you might be more deficient, you might say. Like for you, Arran, like you're very meaning heavy, as you mentioned. You're also quite well versed in the image side, I'd say.
For sure.
Where would you say that you struggle or where you could use more work?
Probably affect mostly. Like I can talk about the emotional side of these experiences, but like I'm really having to dig and like kind of almost like just like what should I feel? It's like, well, like sadness is like what someone normally feels in this kind of situation. Is like, is there sadness there? Probably. You know, as opposed to actually being like, I am actually experiencing sadness right now.
Right.
It's like it's more rare for me to actually be caught up in emotions for any extended period of time. And even when I remember, like going through memories, for instance, like it's very easy for me to remember a lot of details and visuals and explore the memory and kind of like tie a lot of memories together. Like I have like a very strong, very good memory. But if I was going to say like, what were you feeling at the time? I'd be like, oh, I don't remember. I don't know. Like that's not being recorded. So the model is useful. I mean, you can even just use it for yourself as a meditative practice. If you're gonna sit down for 10 minutes a day, you could cycle through Saibam and just be like, what are the sensations today?
Right.
What is the imagery that's coming up today? What's the affect today, etc. And just cycling through yourself in that way is like a good way to get back in touch with your body. And mindfulness practice is sort of aimed at that in a lot of ways. It's like getting in touch with like the body and the unconscious and not being so egoic.
Yeah.
Let's move on to some other concepts here. So pendulation. How would you explain that?
Pendulation is sort of like the concept behind it is that life is sort of made up of these natural pulsations between these different states of expansion and contraction, the ebb and flows, the openness that's suddenly met with a closure. This is just like, it's natural.
Right. I mean, the dialectic is sort of an explanation of this, is that like the world moves in dualities and polarities, and that anytime that there is sort of like a contact between two entities or a polarity in anything, there's always sort of like a relationship that happens there. And like every entity sort of naturally flows between states of contraction and expansion
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the wave pattern.
Yeah.
Like reality is actually just a bunch of waves. There's like the trough and the peak and the
Right.
trough and the peak. So
I think like the spiral is a symbol that Levine uses too to explain this, I believe. And he's quite a Jungian, I might say.
Yeah.
I know he's presented at some of the Jungian institutes before and draws upon this idea as just being very archetypal. So it's a natural underpinning of our psyche and somatic experience to have this sort of movement between these different states. And so pendulation comes into play in SE by when we recognize that there's something that we've encountered that has that energy of trauma, that has the heaviness, that has the overwhelm, that maybe even has the dissociation, that you can be with that for a time and then move to a different pole. And that opposing pole, if we were to look at it through more of like the sensate experience, is that maybe you feel the tightness in the chest. And so you start to attune to that tightness. And you might describe what the sensation of tightness is like, where exactly in the chest it is, how it feels. And then the practitioner might then invite you to find an opposing feeling in the body. Where don't you feel tightness? And so you start to search through the body, and maybe you feel it around the face. My face doesn't feel tight. It's like, okay, let's attune to that for a moment. And it feels open. I feel lightness, like my eyes aren't just squeezed together. And then as you are kind of adjusting to this new pole, you move back, you pendulate back to the tightness in the chest, and then back to the openness in the eyes. And this allows you to move between an arousal state and a calm state. And in theory, you're sort of slowly metabolizing or getting in touch with the thing that triggered the arousal state in the first place. And that allows you to be with it and not just like immediately get overwhelmed. But not only that, you get to find a new resource. And I think that's a big part of SE too, is like resourcing an individual with new sensations or new images, new behaviors, whatever, that lift you up or that ground you or that make you feel safe in the body.
Yeah.
So pendulation is really interesting in that way.
Yeah, I mean, you can see this concept in a lot of different places. I mean, if you were going to have to handle or approach something that was chaotic or difficult or dangerous, that the best way to do that would to just be to do it sort of like a little bit and then go back to your safe place and go back to the danger and then go back to your safe place and go back to the danger and go back to your safe place.
Yeah.
And that you could see that being done, even like a very literal sort of physical way. It's, you go back, you go to work and then you go back to your house and you go to work and you go back to your house and you go back to work. And if you were just at work all the time, you would die basically. And if you were at home all the time, unless you're, terribly wealthy, you wouldn't really get much out of your life. And so going back and forth from these places of work and safety or danger and safety is like a natural process. But you could also see how therapeutically you might, if you're going to do this like imagistically, if you're going to bring up a traumatic memory, this isn't necessarily approaching from the body, but if you were bringing up a traumatic memory, you might fluctuate between approaching the traumatic memory and then going back to like a sort of safe or happy memory, or like a safe imagined place, like a beautiful, safe forest with all your animal friends where like no one's going to hurt you. And then you go back to this difficult memory and then you go back to your safe forest, etc. And so you could understand how approaching trauma this way, just the concept of pendulation, can be a useful way to think about it.
Yeah. Well, when we're dealing with trauma and there's dysregulation in the nervous system, the window of tolerance that most people have naturally is severely affected. So you have to rebuild tolerance. And in that way, it's almost like, I don't know. I know SE isn't thought of as like an exposure therapy, but it's sort of like get in touch with a thing that makes you feel uncomfortable or that triggers like something that says like, this is wrong, this isn't right, I can't deal with this. But doing it gently enough so that your body can handle what processes are coming up, which might be something as intense as like hyperventilating or totally dissociating or getting really emotional and crying, but being able to be with it enough so that next time you come back to it, you can stay with it a little bit longer. And that's when they talk about the window of tolerance. The window of tolerance needs to grow.
Yeah.
And trauma affects that on a fundamental level so that that kind of standard heroic myth of like, oh, here's the challenge, just leave, the known world and venture out, even though it's so scary and overwhelming. Well, he must have a very healthy window of tolerance. You can just jump right out. But for someone who's coming from a more wounded place, there has to be healing. So maybe you take just a step outside the fence and then you go back. And then the next time, 2 or 3 steps. And that's what pendulation allows.
What about titration?
Titration, I think this is another just like kind of fundamental principle that SE practitioners seem to work from.
Yeah.
Which is that it's the gradual exposure. And I guess how it differs from pendulation is that the idea is to slow things down to this very gentle way of experiencing what's happening to you, and where in the body you might be experiencing, say, your breath suddenly just getting faster and faster. So rather than moving to the pendulation technique, what you might need here is titration. So the practitioner will call attention to your breath starting to get faster and faster, and they'll ask you to slow it down. Or can you take a little bit of a deeper breath? Or can you pause long enough to notice what's happening? And I think another thing that's important in this framework is that we don't want to stop what's happening. We don't want it to almost like have a label of like, this is a bad thing. Like I shouldn't be reacting this way. I should hold back that right now I want to like punch the wall, but rather slow down that process so that you can be with some of that distress and act it out in a way that you just don't fly off the handle or totally dissociate. And so for me, how I've experienced this is when I start to move into these emotional hyper arousal states. One time my SE therapist said, I noticed that you're rubbing your eye a lot. And it was weird because I didn't notice it. And I'm kind of my left hand up and I'm just sort of pressing it against my eyelid. And so what she did was just ask me to notice it at first. And rather than telling me to stop, she just told me to slow it down. And that building that first moment of awareness, that acknowledgement, allows the body to do what it's doing, which in some ways I think at that time was a bit of like a comforting action because I'm feeling myself, we're talking about something that's kind of overwhelming for me. I'm trying not to get into too bad of a state. And then there's a lot of comfort actions that I think come out for people, whether you have experienced extreme trauma or not, because it might be just like a shaking of the leg. Maybe you start to rub your arm a little bit. Maybe you rock yourself back and forth. And you talked about like the baby in the beginning of the episode. And it's like, how do we interact with children who we can't have these deep conversations with? How do we tell them they're okay? We hold them. We rock them in our arms, kind of bounce them on the hip. And it's really interesting to notice that we enact those similar things to bring a sense of comfort in an adult distress state.
So titration is essentially gradual exposure. And I believe titration, the place where I've heard it before is in chemistry, where there's like a system set up where you're just dropping a little amount into a solution and not just like pouring the cup in.
Yeah,
it's like one drop at a time. That's titration.
Okay.
So the idea is that integration in all its forms, you can apply this universally pretty much to everything, but specifically, with shadow integration is something that we obviously talk about a lot. But titration is implying that you can't simply integrate your shadow in one go. Just like, I'm going to do it like right now, like integrating shadow, like, if you actually expose yourself to like a lot of traumatic memories at once, you'll have this total backlash. It won't work. And it might even make things worse. Or if you try to integrate the shadow of a relationship you have with someone, it might really rub the other person the wrong way. If you try to like confront them and say, let's like get all this out on the table and figure out like what's really going on, they might just push you away, and it might make things even worse than they were before. So the idea is that integration, taking some sort of trauma, some sort of darkness in you, some sort of chaos that you've experienced, and healing that, reclaiming it, making it whole again, making yourself whole again, has to happen gradually, slowly, one drop at a time. And so titration, as you explained, working through the body with SE, might be, don't go to a traumatic embodied place like all at once. Like let's do it real slowly, one drop at a time. But you can see how it applies to any sort of work you might do on yourself. If you want to get into physical shape, even like don't go out and run 30 miles if you're out of shape. It's like, what do you do? You'll break yourself. So what do you do? It's like you go for 2 miles a day. Titration, right?
This is so interesting because as you were talking about titration from a chemistry standpoint, I was like thinking about when you're cooking, you have to temper eggs. And so you have a recipe where you have eggs, but you also have hot liquid. And if you're just going to add the eggs, they would scramble or curdle. So you have to add a little bit of hot liquid to the eggs slowly to temper it. And then finally you can continue the recipe. So it's like almost like this universal principle, whether it's the body or chemistry or fitness.
Yeah. I mean,
archetypal.
You know how my mind works. I always like zoom out as far as possible, but like all these patterns are universal. Like they're not just psychological. They're not just embodied. They're not just in the animal kingdom. They're like in the physical universe itself. Like the dialectic is a physical property of the universe. Titration, physical property. These waves that we're talking about, contraction, expansion for pendulation. It's like a physical property.
What happens when opposite forces clash together and they don't get to like naturally meet? I'm thinking of like intense weather patterns where it's like a hot stream and a cold stream just totally collide, and then suddenly you have like a hurricane or something like that.
Right. Or you have like two individuals in a social scene and they have really strong personalities and they just like hate each other basically and fight a bunch and they just like never talk to each other. That's because it's like happening too quick. Whereas like they very slowly like interact a little bit and kind of talk, like they're actually integrating the relationship, and maybe they might become really good friends and become really strong personalities, like as one. Right. So lots of interesting illustrations there. But to close out, somatic experiencing, it's essentially embodied therapy. It's body first. It's bottom up. It's starting from our most, you might say, primal animalistic places, our most childlike places, and trying to work from there as opposed to this sort of egoic, hubristic, is that the right word? Way of approaching things, which is just like intellectual and like we're all super, super rational adults. Like that's really a myth. We're mostly irrational. So conceptually, it's something to think about in your own work for yourself. That might mean just like exercising more, or doing yoga, or meditating, or just like when you get up in the morning, think about your body. How does your body actually feel? What are the sensations in your body? You can approach it conceptually like that, or obviously you can explore somatic experiencing specifically. There's a lot of practitioners that you can find. You can look up Peter Levine. You can find his website. You can read his books. A lot of good information out there. And as far as the full package of self-work goes, somatics obviously is very important. If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/goldenshadow.org.
If you like to keep up to date with my musings and writing, subscribe to the Golden Shadow Journal at substack.goldenshadow.com.
If you're interested in working with myself or Alyssa, go to our websites, alyssapolizzi.com and arranrogerson.com.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.